Today I want to ask and answer some pretty big questions about life, society, and how you and I fit into that world around us. Social life, in other words. Why is it a constant source of conflict, internally, externally? And I think Freud might have some interesting answers for us, maybe not the definitive answers. So to that end, three questions. I want to ask three questions today. Why can't I be happy all of the time? Why can't I be happy most of the time? No, naturally this depends on your definition of happiness, but I think most of us for the most part would agree that we're not constantly happy, and that most of life is kind of either ho-hum or a genuine struggle. Why can't we be happy? Especially if we have a decent amount of food, shelter, clothing. We don't have to be rich, but why aren't we happy? Number two, why is society in a constant state of turmoil or conflict? It's just ongoing. It just never seems to end. Centuries, millennia of human existence on track record, and yet here we are in what most of us would call a modern world with conflict. Why doesn't it end? What does it take to get things to be harmonious? What does it take to have peace, both within cultures but also cross-culturally or trans-culturally? Why can't we all just get along? I think Freud might have some answers for us. And three, why don't I always like myself? Why are so many of us who are, and I'm thinking of all the decent people I know, the good people I know, that are so hard on themselves, that they might like themselves in some minimally acceptable way. Yeah, sure, I'm me, okay, fine. Maybe they're not super tough on themselves, but they don't always necessarily like themselves. So why can't we be happy? Why can't society be harmonious? And why don't we always like ourselves even some of the time for some of us? Sigmund Freud. You need a little bit of coffee to understand Sigmund Freud. I don't understand Sigmund Freud. I think I have a general idea of Sigmund Freud. I'm not even sure if Sigmund Freud understood Sigmund Freud. 1856 and 1939. Sigmund Freud. He is the father of what's called psychoanalysis. Psychoanalysis. I mean, that just sounds cool, right? It's meant to be a treatment of sorts for what is natural to all of us. All of us struggle with certain things, the way our mind works, and psychoanalysis is supposed to be a way of helping us deal with ourselves, but life in general. It's sometimes called the talking cure. You can imagine the quintessential or the standard image of someone going into an office, laying down on a couch, and the therapist sitting beside them with a notepad and some glasses, right? Oh, tell me about your day. And the person just starts talking. It's called the talking cure because through talking, the unconscious or the part of ourselves that we've repressed or we don't know about, the issues that are sort of the tensions and things that are within us, come out. Now, it's not a cure. It's not like you're going to walk into somebody's office and then walk out of the office never having to deal with these issues again. But it's a cure in that sense that what was once hidden and unknown can now be looked at or dealt with in a meaningful way. So we can find some sense of meaningful cohabitation with these issues. Some of which may be overcome in the sense that they no longer hold us back, but the basic struggles that we're going to be talking about today, the basic struggles will always be there. Now, psychoanalysis then, a number of layers to it, of helping us cope with reality. Not as a permanent one-time fix cure, certainly not in the sense of handing out prescription medications or something like that, a very popular thing in culture today. If you have stresses or tensions, anxieties, you get a pill. Sometimes, not always. And that may be needed, it might not be, I'm not in a position to judge that. But in this sense of psychoanalysis, many of the issues that we suffer from, the ailments, the neuroses, or the psychoses, there's a whole spectrum now of possible issues, talking them out, getting to know yourself in some meaningful way helps with life. I'm sure you might be able to sympathize with this. Just talking with somebody, a frustration. So my wife was at the grocery store yesterday and there was a gentleman in front of her and there was a good sale on steaks, and she was waiting in line patiently, and he literally loaded up every single steak into his cart and left. There was no minimum sign. And when I say loaded up, I mean a full-size, large, like Costco-sized grocery cart, filled it up, walked out of the store. Like paid for it, obviously, didn't steal the stuff. It's that kind of thing that drives her nuts, because it's just not socially responsible. It just disregards everybody else, literally standing in line behind you, waiting for the same thing. So she needed to talk about it. So she got in the car, she's very upset, and she just wanted to talk with me. She wasn't looking for a solution. She wasn't looking for a pill. She wasn't looking for, oh, I'll buy you something nice. She just wanted to talk about the anxiety, the stress, or the annoyance of what she had just encountered. And that goes for most things in life, right? You see something on TV, the race riots, people getting hurt, and you need to talk about it. But what about the things that we don't even know about? What about childhood abuses or things that have got traumas in general that we don't think about, that we want to leave them behind? Are they really left behind? Or are they in us and they're causing issues and causing problems? Psychotherapy says, hey, listen, they're there and they're probably causing you some problems. So let's look at these inner conflicts and bring them out in a helpful, context, in a helpful way, just by having dialogue. Freud's great discovery is what he calls the unconscious. I can almost say unconscious. Conscience is with science, conscience. Consciousness or conscience is different. It's not something that we have knowledge of. The unconscious is something that we are unaware of. He uses the example of an iceberg. If you've ever seen an iceberg, they're pretty amazing. In person, you see this huge thing out of the water, white, if it's in the ocean, you can see them in the Great Lakes, where I am all the time. And if you're crazy enough to get close to them in a boat, what you'll notice is the closer you get, the larger the iceberg actually is underwater. Vastly larger underwater. And he uses this metaphor or analogy as a way of saying, that's how you and I work. That's how our minds work. He's caught because he wants to be a scientist, looking at the material facts, the actual neurons of the brain or something, and then he's caught with this, on the other side, this artistic or metaphorical description of how the mind works. So we're sort of the spectrum now between this is literally the gray matter that's in your skull and trying to explain how that gray matter works. It's very difficult to do. So many people look at psychoanalysis as an example of something that's talking about something so subjective that it can't really be a science. We're not going to get caught up in that debate too much. But he's trying to do, he thinks that the body and the mind are very much connected. He's not just trying to make up some sort of spiritual or purely story-like an explanation as to how we work. He thinks this is a universal thing for everybody in every culture. If you have a mind, you're a human being, there's this iceberg-like structure to you. What does that mean? 3 layers. The conscious mind is what you see above the surface, and we're aware of that, right? You understand, I am me. Most people stopped there, right? If you were a conscious mind, you were a person, you were you, that was it. But he went further, and what's interesting is he speculated actually 2 other elements, so 3 in total. He speculated what he called the preconscious, and then underneath what we're completely unaware of, the unconscious. We typically call that today subconscious, but he used the word unconscious. So the real you is vastly more than you. That is, the real you is more than you are aware of. Now, we have a couple of tests we can do to see if this might be true. But if that is the case, then I feel schizophrenic. A schizophrenic split mind. I feel like multiple people in one, if that's true. And if that's also true, then that seems to compromise my sense of freedom. If I'm the conscious mind, I'm making decisions, Freud comes along and goes, actually, many of the decisions and actions that you do in life are not being controlled by that top thin layer of the iceberg that you see above. It's actually this vast, huge whatever underneath. Lifetime of experiences that you do not control, that you haven't fully processed. These are conditioning your behavior, which is why you often do things you don't want to do. It's why you often do things you don't want to do. And I've used this example before of the person who wants to exercise but they don't. Is it just that I lack the discipline to exercise, or is there something else going on? A quick example. We'll get back to this in a second. Freud wasn't the first person to think about some kind of unconscious mind and layers of the mind, different yous within you, but he certainly made it very popular and became famous for it. Consider his job, what he's doing. He's talking with people and he's trying to figure out how we tick. And he's hearing again and again these people coming in and they're kind of surprised by the stories, their own lives in a way. So they start thinking about their childhood or they start thinking about an abusive spouse or something like that. And the more they think about themselves and their history and where they've been, the more this repressed stuff starts coming out. Stuff that was packed away and ignored. And Freud's response is, well, why would we have this repressed element within us? Well, it doesn't make any sense. Where would it come from except that it must be a different part of the mind? And he postulates, again, I use the word postulate too many times already, this idea of a preconscious as a judge of sorts or a watchman that sorts through what can come to the conscious mind or what needs to stay in this unconscious mind. So you just think it's like an arbitrator or a medium of some kind, or median. And through psychoanalysis, through just being, I'm really tired of feeling bad about this or bad about that, and you may be on your own without a psychotherapist, you have these breakthroughs of discovering what was repressed. So the only way to explain why or how the human mind can repress something is to come up with another part of the mind doing these things. And the only way to really think about, well, why would it not just stay repressed? Why would it somehow find its way to the conscious mind? Is maybe there's this third element in between, the preconscious, that's acting as some sort of judge in between the two. That might never happen for some people, right? The preconscious might never allow any repressed memory or trauma to come to the surface. But what Freud had discovered is that many people, in fact, are reliving these repressed experiences over and over and over again. It's like they were being tortured. What was the positive effect of the preconscious, or whatever you want to call it, dredging up these unconscious experiences and reminding someone, whether in a dream, a daydream, or just in daily life, just constantly remembering a terribly embarrassing experience or a genuinely traumatic, a car crash or something like that? How is that a healthy mechanism for the mind? And in fact, that's why we need something like psychoanalysis to help us deal with these issues and to understand them in context and to, again, not to cure them and just to erase them, but to learn to cope in some meaningful way to develop a strong psyche. So this already answers part of the question. Why am I not happy? Because maybe I haven't learned to deal with my own life yet. In some way, maybe I am repressing the truth of my experience and it's just gnawing at me. All right, so we're trying to get an idea now. What is this mind thing? Well, it's got different parts, and these different parts do different things, and we can see these manifest in our daily lives, and we can certainly see these when we go to a therapist or something like that. The obvious mind is the conscious mind. Most people, most of the time, would have thought that's just all we are. But the more we think about it, the deeper the reservoir grows, the bigger the mind is, and maybe even more controlling the mind is that we don't know anything about, the unconscious mind. Later on, he starts to add, in his writing, he starts to add different things. This is famous as well, the id, or the it, in German. The id represents our instincts. We'll talk about that. The ego, and then the superego, and these all do different things as well. But still we have that generally three parts to the mind, or three parts to how we act. The id is a reflection of the unconscious, the instincts and the drives that maybe you don't know about. I'm dancing around the words now. Instincts is probably the better word. When we think of animals, we think of instincts, so that's maybe not the better word, but we need to be careful. Again, we're just trying to get the basics here. The id, unconscious. The ego is like this sort of preconscious thing in some way. And then the superego is, well, we'll talk about it, but it's a branch off of the ego. And both the ego and the superego are both unconscious and conscious. Okay, we don't need to worry about that too much. So how do you know whether or not this might be right? Do I have an unconscious mind? Am I more than just me? By me, I mean just me right now. Are there sort of, if you picture the mind like a whole bunch of hamsters running on the wheel, and then all of a sudden the argument is, yeah, you think you're these hamsters, these processes, these mechanisms, and you're just, your daily tasks. But in fact, there's so much more to the story. There are all kinds of other animals on wheels and cogs, and it's a very diverse, active ecosystem inside your mind. And because you've been so unaware of what's been going on behind the scenes, this has just compounded the difficulties of life and the tensions and stress and anxieties. You don't have internal harmony, in other words, so you certainly can't have external harmony, which gets in the way of happiness and social harmony. Okay, so here's the test. How do you know if you have an unconscious mind? Well, let me ask you, where were you born? Oh, well, I was born, where was I born? I was born in Onsan. I had to think about it. I literally had to think about that for 0.4 of a second. Where was I born? What happened there? Well, there's the conscious mind of me talking right now, and I can drink coffee and I'm thinking fine, but then you ask me for a piece of information, or I asked me for a piece of information, and I had to pause, and one of those little hamsters on the wheel running around in my brain ran to the back room to ask the other hamster or the other gopher or whatever else, hey, where was he born again? And that information had to come back. The information wasn't here, it was back there somewhere. In the very least, that's suggestive that there are layers to what's going on now. That moves from the preconscious or unconscious to the conscious mind. One of the ones that Freud looks at are the parapraxes, the slips of the tongue, the Freudian slips. You heard the Freudian slip phrase before? You want to say X, whatever that is. You want to say, I like apples, but you end up saying something completely different. You don't know why you said it. But the more you think about why you said what you said, it actually has meaning. It actually conveys a truth maybe that's embarrassing and you don't want people to know. That's why people laugh at Freudian slips or the slips of the tongue or the parapraxis, because they feel like often, maybe not always, that when someone says something incorrect, they didn't mean to say it. It's not just that the words were the incorrect words, it's that they were the right words to convey a whole different reality. I'm trying to think of an example. That doesn't really happen to me very often. It's happened to me a couple of times. You'll know it when it happens to you. Right? The truth comes out, in other words. The truth comes out even though you don't mean it to. Well, if you're just a conscious mind, if you're just you, how could the truth come out if you didn't mean it to? If there's any meaningful relationship between that slip of the tongue and your life, that too is suggestive of different layers of you. Another one is, for me at least, sometimes if I'm a little tired, I never drive when I'm tired. I'm a very strict driver when it comes like that. But sometimes I'll think about something and I'll drift off just a little bit in my head, and then I'll find that, oh wow, I just went through a whole series of steps driving on the highway, and I wasn't fully aware of it. It's not just motor memory. It's that I've made decisions while driving, stop at a light, lane change, whatever. I've made these decisions while driving with a conscious effort of sorts, but it's not really conscious because I was busy thinking about philosophy. I was busy thinking about Freud. So how did I do it? Again, suggestive that there are layers to the mind. All of these different things. The big question we want to consider today: is there an unconscious or an id? Is there the it within me? And calling it the it is so weird, right? It's sort of like this animal inside of me, an it, that has instincts that maybe I don't control, maybe I don't know anything about. And it's just creepy, right? It's just creepy, especially because of the Stephen King movie It, which is a whole different, don't worry, we're not getting into that. Asking these questions sets us up for thinking about the larger issues, or the issues of happiness and social harmony and happiness with ourselves. Psychoanalysis is clearly interested in you as an individual. How can we help you deal with X, Y, Z, whatever? But by extension, if we have a whole bunch of people who are finding some sense of equilibrium, or maybe not harmony, but they're learning about how to deal with the tensions within them, then that will extend to society. So hopefully psychoanalysis now informs not only a healthy living for the individual, but culture in general. We don't have to agree with everything he says. I don't. But again, it might set us up in the right direction for accepting who we are and how we operate a little bit more than just being sort of dismissive of these underlying issues that prevent us from achieving permanent, fixed, forever happiness. Freud's famous text, Civilization and Its Discontents, asks us to think about how we relate to society. It's pretty obvious that society has some pretty strong restrictions, and depending on, probably everywhere, but depending on where you are, some of those restrictions, especially on sexuality, can be incredibly strict, very strong. And this leads to tensions and anxieties within us and makes us, rebel and these different things. So why would we want to be a part of society that tells us what to do all the time? It's like another parent, do this, do that, wear this, get a job, pay taxes, and all these different things. Does society at heart make life worse? Right? Because it has these overly controlling, overbearing power structures. And we've been talking about Foucault and Nietzsche and Chomsky, all these different people, and they seem to suggest that there are a lot of things in society that make us sicker, whether it's people trying to control us, a misunderstanding of good and power, society doesn't seem to be the super great thing. Well, Freud, we have to be in society, right? We're not just going to go on a desert island. And in fact, if you do go to a desert island to try to avoid a lot of these things, many of the issues will follow you there, right? And we're going to discuss why. Wouldn't it be great to return to some sort of pre-social whatever? A state of nature where there are no police officers, no military, we don't need them, we just live in harmony with creatures. Is that even realistic? Rousseau, a famous philosopher that saw society as fundamentally corrupting us, he understood too that we can't just walk away from society. We are by nature necessarily social creatures. But maybe as social creatures, we can do something to make it better, to make the world around us better, avoiding that escapism. And this is, I think, part of Freud's positivity here, that while this is going to sound largely negative, the things that are holding us back, things that are making us difficult, the point of this conversation is largely a positive one. So we'll see when we get there. So Civilization is Discontents. A text addressed to people who are saying they're discontent with society, they're angry at society. And Freud's going to come down on both sides, saying, yeah, there's good reason for being annoyed with society, especially with some very heavily restricted libidos and all these different things. But also, society performs an essential role that helps us discipline ourselves in a way that maybe we need and that many of us don't do ourselves. And then if left to our wildest devices, we would be very destructive. So we need society to help us deal in many respects with our destructive impulses. Depending on which culture you live in, I think for the most part, society expects you to learn how to control the it within you, the id, the instincts, these impulses. And when you don't, it compounds the issue because it makes you feel guilty. I knew I shouldn't have robbed the bank, or I knew I shouldn't have had an affair, or I knew I shouldn't have polluted in the river, a bucket of oil or something. And then, but I did it, and now I feel even more guilty because I wasn't following the rules. Can we really control ourselves, our deep impulses? Should we feel bad when a murderer or a cannibal, okay, I'm making that's too extreme. Should we feel bad when a power-hungry politician does terrible things to people, but he's just pursuing his own will to power? He's only pursuing his own truth. Should we feel bad? So the basic questions are this. Society expects us to learn how to control our deepest, darkest desires in some helpful way. If we can control our id, whatever this thing is, our unconscious, if we can control it, then holding people responsible makes sense. We should have prisons. We should have some sort of penal system that, the lawyers and judges and whatnot, and financial reprisals. We should have these things. But at the end of the day, if we cannot, our id is just this wildly untamable thing, then punishing people just makes things worse. I'm not sure what a middle ground would look like, but the argument that we simply cannot control our inner selves seems to lead us to this sort of social anarchy. You can't hold anybody accountable. I have no way of really proving one way or the other, except to say that as a society, we're doing okay. We could do better, of course, holding people accountable. And when they get caught for doing bad things, or they do bad things, let's hope that most of them change course. They self-discipline. They learn to look at their repressed issues that were motivating them to do what they were doing, and so on. So I need to be careful. But those are the two basic questions. Can we control the id? If so, responsible, great. If we can't, well, then we lead to some problems regarding whether society is even possible at all. But then on top of this is, how much can we control? So yes, I can control myself. I'm not going to go murder people. I don't want to murder people anyway, but what do I want to do? I want to go rob a bank, so I have lots of money. Well, I can control myself. I'm not going to do that. But I'm not able to control myself all the time. My wife brought a cheesecake into the house. I like sugar. I'm diabetic. What do I do? What do I do? Every day is this delicate balance, right? Of trying to control the id, the instinct, the desire for pleasure. We're trying to control it. So now it becomes a question of, can we or can't we? We move beyond that and say, well, how much can we? Because if society is demanding too much discipline, there's not enough wiggle room. When you bring an animal home, let's say when you got a hamster from the pet store, the bigger the cage, the better, right, for the animal, so it can run around. Well, within that cage, at least, the discipline of that cage, it can run around. But if you have a very small area in which the animal's going to suffer. So is society giving us room? You know, a little rebellion here, a little rebellion there, or is it too controlling? Okay, more issues to consider. The basic problem with the individual and society is that society is basically against the interest of the individual. That is our liberty and our freedom. Because society is about trying to keep people together in relative harmony, however much that's possible, which means you can't have free reign. By being in society, you're in some kind of cage, you're in some kind of confined territory. Fine, okay, we accept that, we know that. But again, it's a question of health. What kind of cage, how big, how small, and if people feel, this might be a big cage, but if people feel like it's too small, that raises a whole other set of questions as well. So there's just this perception now. Maybe your society isn't overly restrictive. Maybe you live in quite a free, liberal culture, like I do, but you don't know it until you visit some other cultures, maybe. But that's a different conversation. What is humanity? Freud argues that you and I, as individuals, as humanity generally, the species is caught between a desire for love and a desire for death. The death drive, we're going to talk about both the desire for life and desire for love, but also the death drive. But the death drive, the instinctual self, the id, whatever this unconscious thing is that has motivating us to behave in a certain way, he divides that into two parts, eros and thanos. Eros is this desire for life, life-affirming, desire for pleasure, and thanos, which is this a strange thing. Your instincts to eat are good. They keep you alive. They're still instincts. They're part of the id. They're driving you to do something that maybe you don't think about, to sleep, to procreate, protection. These are instincts towards life. Great. If I didn't have the instinct to sleep or eat, I would probably end up in a lot of trouble pretty soon, right? You get sick and you wouldn't maybe know why even. So these are good instincts. The flip side of that is what he considers to be the death drive or the death instinct. The death instinct. I'm going to say death drive. And what this does, especially when it's aimed outward, it can be inward as a form of aggression, and it can be outward as a form of aggression. It seeks destruction, annihilation, a tearing down, a disintegration. And again, he's trying to explain his patients' lives, their inner thought lives, and why they do what they do. And this is one of the key ways of explaining that. Why torture yourself with these repressed ideas over and over again? Why keep reliving the past that you can't change? Well, maybe it's because by our nature, how we are, we engage in these things purposefully. Like our mind instinctively does these things. Not our conscious mind, but that, I'm going to say barbaric, but maybe that's not the right term. The id, that unconscious part. So on the flip of these two polarities, love in all of its forms, and he's going to discuss this under the pleasure principle. Easy rewards, pleasures of any kind. Gimme, 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 right? That's awesome. Sign me up for a cheesecake. Sign me up for, living on the beach kind of thing. But this other part that you don't have a choice in, this is just part of who you are. This is just part of how the human mind works. You're not inherently an evil person, and then you get this death drive. You're just a person, right? Babies will eventually have these two, flip, bipolar, whatever these things are. And it's the desire for destruction. Do I desire destruction? Do I want to see the world burn? So maybe think of something like the Joker in Batman, right? Alfred and Batman are talking in the movie account. And Batman is kind of questioning the Joker's, like, why? What's going on here? And Alfred says, some people just want to see the world burn. Well, Freud says, no. Everybody wants to see the world burn. Batman wants to see the world burn. But hopefully, he's able to somehow control that instinct. Kind of a dark picture, but maybe explains why you don't always love yourself. Maybe that explains why society is always in disharmony or disarray. Even if a wealthy, full of laws, maybe this explains this perpetual need to push harder for harmony. In my own thought, I sometimes wonder if he's just not describing the immature among us. Is it true that we are all these two sides, and that no amount of reason, you can't reason your way out of this. You can't cure this even through psychotherapy. You can't, right? Psychoanalytic therapy will not solve this. You're just stuck. Sorry. But maybe he's just describing a certain segment of society, the mentally ill. Maybe he's just describing, again, the immature. Or maybe he's describing the jokers, right? The really, truly evil people. He doesn't think so. Which means I need to ask myself, in what ways do I really, truly desire destruction in some way? And maybe, this is going to sound silly, maybe it's in wanting a cheesecake. Right? I know I'm diabetic. Sugar is toxic to me. Well, that kind of refined amount of sugar is toxic to me. And I still desire it anyway. Is that all the proof I need, right? On the highway, people who drive too fast, you know the thrill of driving too fast for many people ends in destruction, families dead, all these different things. And yet we pursue these thrills because it's fun, it's a form of pleasure, and simultaneously often very destructive. Are these examples maybe? Or how about this? That as a culture, many of us are obsessed with terrible movies. Like mainstream media in terms of Saw movies or just the gratuitous violence, right? Ultimate fighting, right? Where people just punch the snot out of one another as if that's interesting. When it's destruction, it's damage. So more generic monster truck rallies. You see these giant monster trucks rolling up over cars and you see them crushing cars. Why is that entertaining? I mean, if you break it down to its basic constituent parts, oversized truck, highly fuel inefficient, not really doing anything in terms of transportation, but it's crushing cars, so I like it. It's interesting, right? It's very interesting. So the basic problem then becomes not just what's happening internally that's causing strife, but how does the I, whatever I is, interact with the we, the social world? And if we're a bunch of people combating not only our own personal instincts, but also getting anxious and annoyed because of these new controls of being in context, being in a society, people telling us what to do, it just makes things harder and harder and harder. Is society helping you learn to control your inner demon? I'm using these phrases. It's not, Freud would be upset with me, but this inner demon thing that we can never get rid of. Is society helping? Is your education helping you? Are your parents helping you? Or are they compounding the issue, making it harder? So this death drive cannot be done away with reason. You can't solve the death drive. We live in a period of enlightenment, so we're told. Modern technological, scientific marvel at every street corner. And the salvation for our planet is supposed to be good laws that yield justice and equality, but also this science, technology, knowledge, and reason, all of these things are supposed to free us. And Freud comes along and says, it doesn't matter how rational you are, you could be Spock from Star Trek, the most rational being in the universe, and you would still struggle. Presumably if Spock's human, he's supposed to be half human, you would still struggle with this death drive thing. Reason can't fix it. Critical thinking can't fix it once and for all. Well, if that's true, we have our work cut out for us, don't we? We all want to be free. We all want to have a sense of liberty to make our choices and do what we want. And we recognize that society is constantly saying, well, I'm going to do this, but not that, or do a little bit of this, but not about that. There's this balance now. There's this negotiation going on between our own personal sense of freedom and liberty and the social one. We need society, according to Freud, to act as a force or a counterforce to the personal liberties of individuals who would exploit others or hurt others because their death drive is just so destructive. We need, especially when the individual can't control themselves, isn't interested in any kind of therapy, isn't interested in reflection, they're acting like an animal, just pure id kind of thing. I'm exaggerating. We need social forces, police officers, military, educational systems, peer pressure, guilt from parents, maybe. We need all of these things in play to protect us from them, to protect us from ourselves as well as we're disciplined, but to protect us from them who haven't had that compass to orient how they ought to express or deal with their instincts. So this is a good thing. Society is largely a good thing, unless it goes too far. But it's not always a good thing, as you know, because there are so many cultures that take advantage of that take advantage of some of our basic instincts, that will leverage those for things like world wars. Society that funnels our instincts for death can be a terrible society. And you wonder, when you look around the world and you see violent protests or just violence in general, how people have leveraged that inner anger, if you will. So I'm not a violent person. I couldn't hurt a fly. But the argument here is I could hurt a fly, and if I believe strongly in a message, and I believe strongly that my government was telling me the truth, that I needed to pick up arms and fly to another part of the world and start killing people, that I could do it. And based on history, although I can't imagine ever doing something like that, based on history, that seems to be true. The peaceful among us, the educated, compassionate, good, decent human people around us can flip switches, as we saw with Eichmann, as we saw with Hannah Arendt. They can flip, and there's another part of them, a much more brutal, violent, scary part that can act. Freud seems to be largely correct now. It's not just society telling us what to do. Of course, that's obviously the case. It's society telling us what to do, and we have the means or the mechanism or the motivation or the passion or the ability to fulfill it. If Trudeau came to me and said, go kill these bad people, but I was, really, truly 100% of a pacifist, he would have no effect, right? Well, obviously I'm not going to do that. But time and again we see that even the most peaceful among us can be turned quite quickly. So maybe that is just part of our nature, that full spectrum of possibility. Maybe that's probably the best way to think about Freud in general. And he's looking at us and he's adding new layers of possibility, possible mechanisms of the mind that we're unaware of. And that is giving us a better account of how we actually live our lives. Just imagine other possible versions of you to make sense of you. So let's talk about the pleasure principle and the reality principle. These help us understand a little bit more of who we are, maybe. So the pleasure principle, you want to be happy. You want happiness in all of its forms, all of its pleasures. This is the id screaming out, give me, give me, give me, give me, give me. All right? It doesn't, whatever it might be. I joke about cheesecakes or licorice or sugar or something like that, but it might be sex, drugs, rock and roll. It might be collecting cars. It might just be whatever. There are so many ways of going about this. It's you trying to gratify your desires without really thinking about them. If you're just a pure id, you wouldn't even reflect upon them, and you just try and satisfy them, which can be very dangerous, obviously. for a number of reasons, including, in my case, overeating or something, but maybe too many sexual partners, STDs, and difficulty forming bonded relationships. Who knows? I can come up with all kinds of examples. Be different for all of us. The pleasure principle is gimme, gimme, gimme. Okay, here's the deal. It is not normal for Freud, and this is a really big insight, it is not normal, according to Freud, for us to be happy all the time. You cannot satisfy these desires permanently forever. So I love coffee, but 2 hours from now, 3 hours from now, I might want another one, probably. You can't live in that. It's an unending hunger. At which point, if it's true, then happiness isn't a state, whatever we mean by happiness or pleasure, isn't a permanent state. It's something as a momentary increase above the norm. It is abnormal. Happiness is abnormal. I hope it happens to you a lot. I hope it happens to me a lot. But we should not expect it to happen all of the time. And when we do, when we get Hollywood celebrities or especially brands for companies trying to sell us a Mercedes or sell us something else, you get this impression that if you have the right series of products, I mean, you know consciously this isn't true, but it's feeding that unconscious desire for happiness, which is also a conscious desire for happiness, but that unconscious side that's saying that you will just find this satisfaction with the right amount of money and the right location and the right kind of clothes, all these different things. You won't. You won't. The hunger will still be there. You'll want something else. I have personally experienced this many different times. I was sure that if I bought a motorcycle, I'd be happy, so I bought a motorcycle. Didn't work. Well, no, I bought the wrong kind of motorcycle, so I had to buy a Spider. It's a 3-wheel. So I bought a Spider. Oh, no, it didn't work. I mean, they sell these things. They're dangerous too. They end up selling these things. You're like, well, geez, I wasn't happy. Maybe I need a boat. Maybe I need whatever. You can have all of the things in the world, you'll still be unhappy. But when you do achieve happiness, congrats, it's wonderful. You should conceive of it and not be depressed, but you can conceive of it as this momentary lapse from the normal. Normal might just simply be boring, and that's okay, right? Boring. I'm not suggesting pain, not suggesting suffering, but don't beat yourself up if you're not happy all the time. This is one of the biggest issues, I think. When we're not happy, we feel like failures. I've done something wrong. My life hasn't been operated correctly. I've done something wrong. I'm not the right person. I'm not good enough. And these issues of guilt, and we'll get to that in a moment, but all these other things just make it harder and harder and harder. Listen, what if we're not supposed to be happy all the time? Just boring is fine. Maybe boring is not the right word. Just sort of this neutral, life is fine. Happiness when it comes is great, but don't let your id, that thing driving you for pleasure and happiness, don't let it convince you that that's the only voice you should be listening to. There's more to the story. In terms of the pleasure principle, this is where this other part of the preconscious, or the later writings, we get this idea that it's the ego. This is where the ego comes in, and the ego is the judge that basically is common sense. The ego is common sense or reason. So obviously it's more of a conscious thing now, and it is supposed to, or does, talk to the id and say, listen, you want sex all the time. You just want a nonstop drunken, drugged up orgy all the time, and you think that's going to make you happy. But that doesn't match reality. And in fact, if you do these things, you are going to be probably very unhappy long term for a number of reasons. I don't know that, I've never done it. But I'm assuming these things, for obvious practical consequences, will be a bad deal. So there's this ego in us now that's supposed to be this judge of common sense and reason to help us control the id. Does that develop with life experience? I hope. Does it develop in psychoanalysis where we have this conversation about maybe healthy or good things? I hope. Does it happen when people make mistakes and get hurt? I hope. But what if we don't have a strong mind? What if we don't have a strong ego and our id just walks all over it? Well, then we have social rules, we have social etiquette, we have social peer pressure, we have social laws, we have all these other sort of safeguards in place. But ideally, to find some sense of inner harmony, you want a strong ego. You want something that's capable or able to draw the question, is this a good pursuit of pleasure? And the ego brings in this reality principle because it's sort of holding up the standard of reality, the real world. Pleasure, we all want it, great, but hey, this is the real world, and it doesn't really make a lot of sense to beat yourself up because you're not a billionaire living on a yacht or something like that you think will make you happy. Attached to the ego is the superego. And the superego, again, we're just thinking in generalities now, but the idea is that the superego is largely a matter of guilt enforcement or production. The superego is probably something you got from your parents. When your parents or guardians or whoever you looked up to, whoever cared for you, when they would withhold love because you weren't doing the right thing, they were generating a meaningful sense of guilt. You would feel guilty. Oh, I did something wrong. You can see that in dogs, right? When they eat a slipper. You say, no, bad dog. Man, it feels guilty. The superego, again attached to this ego, the common sense thing, the superego is, for those of us who are especially virtuous, I hope I'm becoming more virtuous, but for those of us who are particularly virtuous, the superego is playing a strong role there. Getting you to obey the rules, getting you to do good things, to be a good person. But when you get them wrong, when you don't follow through, you feel bad. And that's because of the superego. So can psychoanalysis help us with our problems? It certainly presents us with an interesting view of our nature, our mind. Whether we agree it's 3 parts or 3 personalities, or however you want to describe these different mechanisms. Keep saying mechanisms, that maybe is the wrong word. But this idea of a tension between love, pleasure, and hate and death, but also between the pursuit of pleasure and common sense or reason or reality principle, these give us some interesting ways of describing personal behavior. So in the young, the expectation is they will just constantly pursue pleasure without any sense of remorse if they get something wrong. And of course that changes. Let me read you a quote now. It's a fairly lengthy quote, but I think it summarizes this up quite well. Quote from Freud, Civilization and Its Discontents. And now I think the meaning of the evolution of civilization is no longer obscure to us. The evolution of human civilization is no longer obscure to us. It must present the struggle between eros and death, this mechanism again, between the instinct of life and the instinct of destruction, and it works itself out in the human species. This struggle is what all life essentially consists of, and the evolution of civilization may therefore be simply described as the struggle for life of the human species. And it is this battle of the giants that our nursemaids try to appease with their lullaby about heaven. There's a lot here. We are a struggle. The struggle to survive is a struggle to deal with our inner instincts that are destructive, and to struggle with maybe overly overbearing rules outside of us, and to find some way to manage, to work with our own destructive instincts and the destructive instincts of those around us. Keep in mind, if this is true, this will always be true, unless we become cybernetic life forms and we adjust our brain. The idea here isn't that it's not a cultural description of one culture over another, or something about human beings. One day maybe we'll evolve into a different kind of thinking species. But for the most part, this is how we all work. That's troubling, if true. But if true, also we can do something with this, maybe. So again, within the id, we have this eros, Thanos, or eros and death drive, or a life-affirming and destructive instinct there, fighting each other. Hopefully, the eros will be stronger. Eros is typically associated with sexuality, and Freud is famous for talking a lot about sex and libido and these sorts of things. But if the force for life is stronger than Thanos, death, then we can expect culture to be culture. We expect it to be alive versus death, dead. But that's the argument, is that you and I genuinely risk annihilation every day we get up. By annihilation, I mean completely gone. One person who gives in to the id instinct and presses that nuclear button and we're all gone. or people who just systematically grind away at the system, destroy the Joker, right? Think of all the evil people you've seen in the movies. What if they had free reign? Annihilation. The severity of this then is not just, oh yeah, we struggle and some days we win, some days we lose. It's like, no, some days we might lose and suicide might take us, right? Suicide of the whole species, destroying ourselves. Forget nature, just no longer providing enough oxygen. You and I risk genuine destruction, according to Freud, every day. At a personal level, again, I struggle with that because I don't feel like that. I recognize that theoretically I could be, a soldier out there doing things, hurting people, killing people if necessary. But at a cultural level, it's more obvious, right? Especially cultural, historical level, this seems to be true. The Eros drive in terms of sex is a bringing together, right? A bringing together, the traditional way of thinking about it, man and woman come together, then they have children, a family, and they've generated more life, and they've generated more connection. That same general idea in life affirming is supposed to happen in culture as well, or society, where you want to draw people together in friendship and solidarity and to love people. And the death drive is that thing that wants to dissolve that, to break apart. And you can literally see this in terms of immigration policies in the US, where those who want to preserve their country as they see it, and they're against any kind of immigration, they genuinely think that they're doing something life-affirming, us versus them. By pushing them back, there's a solidification of them, right? Their unit, their what have you. But you look at that large scale, of course, and it's absurd. The making the us and the them is destructive. It's disconnecting. It's a pushing back. Especially, well, I don't want to get into it too much. How are you living? Are you living a life of connectivity and relationship, or are you living largely one of denial and rejection? And what do you want? For Freud, again, civilization and its discontents, society itself is at risk if we don't prioritize that eros, that unity, that life-affirming and bringing together with other people. Why are people so cruel? Some people so cruel. Why do some people persist in just doing truly remarkably bad things to other people? And you can see this with politicians coming up with terrible laws, voter suppression, you name it. Just people doing bad things to other people that sometimes serve their interests, so you can see how they might benefit from it, but other times are just cruel. Online chat forums and comments, people just being mean. This is one way of trying to explain that they're just not, they're not in control of their id. Their ego is just letting the id run rampant. And this particular part of the ego, the id, this particular part is the destructive side. This whole conversation about the id and destruction and Thanos reminds us that, or doesn't remind us per se, it tells us that we're absurd, we're crazy. Crazy is a politically charged term these days. We're absurd in the sense that we don't make sense. It doesn't make sense to want to be cruel. So don't try and find some common sense answer to it. Freud is doing a descriptive analysis. He's just saying, this is the way people are, and here's an example as to why we can see this is why people are this way. He's not trying to, and therefore we should stop, right? And he's not saying, and therefore, some people are better at avoiding it than others. Correction. He is saying some people are better at avoiding it than others, but he's not saying it can be solved. No matter how good you are at controlling your id through a superego discipline, however good you are, it will still be an issue for your whole life. Another way of thinking about this death drive Thanos thing is to see it as a disruption or a perversion of what is good. Healthy human relationships, happy human relationships, healthy society, again, is constantly threatened with annihilation, not because we just have given up on being happy, but because while we want to be happy, we also want to see it burn, the Joker in all of us. And that defies understanding. The evil there, it defies understanding. Some of his questions, again, why do we torture ourselves really with repressed ideas again and again? Why the traumatic experience is being relived? And the explanation is the death drive. So at the end of the day, here we are. At the end of the day, we want to love and find pleasure, but we can't. We can't always be having pleasure and happiness. At the end of the day, we also apparently want to destroy and to pull apart, to destroy relations. You can see this in high school, right? With so many people, the youth, that just go out of their way to pull down relationships. It doesn't give them anything new except a satisfaction of some kind. Unfortunately, you can see this in adults in high office as well. So what does that mean? It means that you and I are in a constant state of tension and stress with our own desires. We are a combat, a war field. We're just a constant sense of conflict. So you want to be happy all the time, but you're not. Why? Because according to Freud, your desire for happiness is being confronted by an ego, the reality principle, and the reality of reality is that you can't achieve all of these satisfactions. Sorry. So there's a stress, there's a tension there. But then also society is acting like an ego to tell your instincts, hey, chill out, do the right thing, go in the right direction. Part of society would be peer pressure, your parents, political correctness, all kinds of different things telling you how to live. So we're living in a state of desire that can't be satisfied, numerous controls over us, and sometimes a lack of control, oftentimes a lack of control over ourselves. The result is resentment, right? We're tired of the fight. We're tired of the fight with ourselves, which is why often we're not happy with ourselves and we feel guilty and we're tired, trying to achieve something that never fully arrives. It's exhausting. And of course, we're tired when we realize we can't perfectly achieve these things because then we feel less than. Oh, I'm a loser. I didn't, win the Nobel Prize last week, and so on and so on. And if you set the bar too high for yourselves, even if you are amazing, if you could be the world's most amazing person, right? Virtually perfect at everything, then you will have set the bar so high, and then you realize that you haven't achieved perfection. You will still be miserable or upset that you haven't. It's just this vicious cycle. So what do? First of all, we realize that this is sort of a vicious cycle, right? We recognize that there's a cycle involved. We realize that maybe some of our desires are dark and not very good. We realize that perhaps some of my own history is coming back to haunt me over and over again. Just the other day, I remembered something that was super embarrassing and I blushed. It was when I was in grade 8. I remember I was doing a presentation. I hated talking. I was very, very shy. And I got up to talk about, it was a show and tell, and I was talking about how pitches on props work, so an outboard motor prop and pitch. And I had all my notes, and I got up to talk and I lost my notes, and I just went blank, and I could feel myself, red in my face. It was grade 8. And one of the girls that I had a crush on saw me, and you could see she was embarrassed that I was embarrassed, and just totally devolved, right? And it was just terrible doing a public talk anyway, in front of the class for years. And I thought of that just the other day, and I don't remember the context of it, and it was as if it happened that day, right? Years later. I do public talks all the time, but that grade 8, I almost said 8-year-old, but that grade 8 version of myself that is still there in my unconscious, it's not in my conscious mind, came flooding back. Not traumatically, not like I'm going to need therapy or something meaningful for them. I don't need pills or something like that. But it was still there. It was a part of me that will never go away. Never go away. So we learn to manage these things. We learn to live with them. And perhaps that's Freud's greatest advantage here. If he's corrected, this is how we are more or less, then we're learning to live with ourselves. And then we're learning to live with society that's also structured in this way. So we need society. We realize reason, external laws, they're not going to make the world a perfect place. What can we do to be happier? One of the things, and this can go both positively and negatively, is sublimation. This is a fancy term, you've heard this before. Sublimation, where someone comes to you and says, do what I'm telling you because it's the right way, it might not be such a great thing. In Freud, however, there are some people who have a strong psyche or a strong mind, and they can do sublimation and genuinely be happier or find a greater sense of harmony. Not harmony permanent, but a greater sense of it. Sublimation is taking instincts or drives or something that is considered bad and turning it into something good. To take the negative emotions or negative desires and do something positive with them. The example of this is the libido. Society controls our libidos. Many people would love to be having sex all the time, everywhere, and what we have as a culture for most of us is monogamy. And the culture in general wants monogamy because it's supposed to be helpful for raising family, and of course society doesn't want the burden of raising your children. They want you to raise the children. There are a lot of practical reasons why monogamy is pushed for. And for many people, that's just not a natural state. That's not a natural state. A natural state is living your sexual impulses freely. This is the whole 60s thing right there, free love and whatnot. But Freud responds with this. If you want sex all the time, why not consider, quote, you want to take up or consider, quote, higher cultural goals. Higher cultural goals. It's interesting. So yes, we all want certain things in life. We all want cheesecake. I hope you want cheesecake. If not, you're missing out. But there's more. Not all forms of the pursuit of pleasure and satisfying your instincts are equal. Higher cultural goals. So stop trying to have sex with everybody and maybe sublimate that in a way where you take that desire for relationship and companionship and you go out and you do artistic works in the community to help feed the hungry. Or you can go build homes in nations that need it. In other words, refashion your instincts, the energy, these impulses that come up in you. Don't just satisfy them in the most obvious way. You can still try to satisfy your desires because they're going to be there, but do it in a way that's helpful for you and maybe culture. Again, when culture tries to harness it to its own exclusive advantage, whether getting you in the military and taking you to war or something like that, that can be a different form. But sublimation as a routine experience of you disciplining yourself, you can still be happy. In fact, you might even be happier because you found higher cultural goals or you've set higher cultural goals. I'm not in a position to tell you what those are. I don't know. The example he uses is Leonardo da Vinci, who apparently took his sexual desires and took that energy, took that life force and put it into things like friendship, art, and the pursuit of knowledge. Don't just instinctively go after the first thing your id tells you. Right? You might be happy initially, following through on your id's first instincts, but if you set higher goals for yourself, you may find yourself more satisfied. So one of the goals that I had was, I didn't initially have this as a goal, but to take all of my life energy, went into university, probably by my third degree, I have 6 now, but probably by my third degree, I realized that it was actually a really good place for me to be because I could devote my energy, my drives, my instincts, I could devote that to knowledge and the pursuit of understanding, which is really very exciting for me. Not that I have the answers to anything, but I was able to devote that energy to the pursuit of clarity of the universe, clarity about understanding how the universe works, and so on. And so eventually that manifests itself in terms of a PhD. And ever since I've received my PhD, I've wanted to do another one, right? To take that energy, whatever the drive might be, and shape it into something helpful. In my case, I'm not so sure how a PhD just for me was helpful, except that maybe I write books or something and help people, or maybe I do videos and that helps people think about some of these issues. But it was certainly better than just living in my parents' basement playing video games and whatever else. I mean, again, love video games, but higher cultural goal. Not telling you what your higher cultural goal should be. Suggestion is that sublimation, you might find one. Sadly, not many people are good at this. Not many people have the wherewithal, the fortitude, and Freud understands this, to really engage in sublimation. And culture, of course, wants to take advantage of that and to tell you how you ought to sublimate. And that can lead into tyranny and all kinds of other means of control. One of the other ways things go off the rails is scapegoating. So you have all this energy, and if you can sublimate it, repackage it, be creative in something positive and helpful, awesome, go for it. But many people scapegoat by just pointing at others and going, they're evil, let's kill them. Or they're evil, let's lock them out. They're evil, can't let them across the border. You take all of this aggressive energy inside of you, from the id, Thanos, the death drive, and you simply put it on somebody else as an object of scorn or hatred. Now the hypocrisy here is obvious, right? You're picking an enemy, you're basically creating an enemy. Is this one of the reasons why culture is in constant disharmony? Everybody's pursuing an enemy, right? Someone to hate and to be angry at. Because if you're hating yourself, that doesn't feel very good. So you turn that energy outward, that death drive, the desire for disintegration outward. And maybe that's why some people have affairs in monogamous relationships, knowing it will destroy their relationship. Maybe that's why the youth in high school go out of their way to tear down relationships. That scapegoating, that taking the energy out, you are bad. Is it any wonder that we even have a species if this is true? When instead of turning this hostility out, you turn it in, so you haven't learned how to sublimate, you're not really angry at people out there all the time, you're now becoming angry at yourself. This is where the superego and guilt really gets its force. The superego is, Freud is particularly interested in this because he sees his patients as suffering from some kind of internal conflict, an aggression turned inwards in terms of guilt that always says, I'm bad, I'm bad, I'm bad. And maybe that was my grade 8 self, who was so ashamed that he had lost his notes, so he couldn't talk about the pitch on the prop, and I was easily embarrassed when I was young. I suppose I'm probably still easily embarrassed now in a way. That maybe that was that guilt, right? I'm bad. I lost the notes. The girl I have a crush on, she'll never really like me, especially now. And it goes on and on and on. The superego of guilt, I'm bad. The internal agency or whatever that says, the conscience maybe, but kind of a bad conscience, that says you deserve punishment or consequence for a failure to act appropriately. The problem with the superego, among others, is that it knows everything you've done. When your parents get upset when you've done something wrong, they probably only know 10% of what you've done wrong. When society gets upset, they probably know 2% of what you've done. But when you are constantly policing you in that harsh, disciplinary, I'm not good enough, that's infinitely more powerful. And this goes back very much to when we were talking about Foucault with a panopticon or panoptic principle, where you take on this idea of guarding yourself, watching constantly, and internalizing your own judge, jury, and executioner. So the superego can get us to do positive things because guilt can be very positive, right? Some guilt can be good. It keeps me from eating cheesecake. But amplify this, and I might just lose the desire for life, right? If I'm too disciplined or if I feel too guilty, I'm just too bad. Again, that annihilation is at our door, destruction. This dance of guilt with the superego, it offers us happiness in a sense when we fulfill the rules that our parents gave us or society gave us, but it also offers us suffering or pain when we don't follow through. What happens if our parents were Nazis? What happens if we're an Eichmann growing up in Germany, and everyone around us is telling us, feel guilty for not killing the Jews. Well, then we have a conflict. Then we have an obvious conflict. We need to, in some way, overcome that kind of guilt. But the more nuanced explanation is that guilt is actually fairly fluid. Cultures can retrain us to feel guilty about certain things. And that can be scary when other people can get control of our sense or locus or rules for guilt and get us to do things that we do because they've convinced us they're the correct thing to do. At the end of the day, if I'm able to control my hostility, according to Freud, if I'm able to control my aggressiveness internally, then I'm probably going to reach out and hurt other people. But if I'm able to control my aggressiveness against other people, I'm angry all the time, I'm just a real jackass or something like that, then I'm probably internally, externally I look like a nice guy, but probably internally I'm probably very disharmonious or full of guilt and anxiety, tension and stress. So the more peaceful I look, the more messed up I probably am. That too is an interesting idea. When you look around the world and you look at other people and you say, oh, they've got it together, they've figured it out, that person looks happy. If Freud is even a little bit right, don't look at appearances, right? Just because someone looks happy doesn't mean that they are. We don't want people to be unhappy, but we don't want to be guilting ourselves out and making ourselves feel bad because everybody else looks happier when they probably aren't. These are the struggles we are all apparently, for Freud, experiencing. All right, so to return to my earlier questions, why can't I be happy all the time or even most of the time? Because happiness as a permanent state of being or happiness as this permanent something we achieve doesn't make sense. You can have some measure of happiness, but it will ebb and it will flow. And for most of us, most of the time, it will be a momentary emergence or a rising up from the normal, and the normal will just kind of ho-hum. Hopefully, the normal is ho-hum, and it's not something more difficult. Happiness has been misunderstood. So the message from that, don't make yourself feel guilty. Don't be hard on yourself. Don't judge yourself as faulty if you're not happy all the time. We don't want to be miserable, but we don't want to be setting the bar for happiness too high. 2, why is society in a constant state of conflict? Because you are, because I am. We're the parts that make up society, and we are in conflict. We have competing drives and interests, and depending on how much we have control over ourselves, if we're able to exercise psychotherapeutic principles, if we're able to sublimate in a healthy way, it'll all be different for all of us, of course, but the world is in conflict because we are in conflict, and we should not expect to resolve it fully. We can make a better society. Hopefully we can make better people. We can be better people, but conflict is built into us. It's absurd, it's crazy, it doesn't make sense, but that's what it is. Why can't we all just get along? Well, apparently, according to Freud, I don't even get along with me. We all can't get along, maybe we can do better. Emphasize eros, the drive for life, the drive for connection. Push that home. Do our best to deny or redirect the death drive instinct. And the third question, why don't I always like myself? That's a deep question. Why don't I always like myself? To be honest, because if this is true, there are parts of myself I shouldn't like. I shouldn't like the idea that I desire destruction. I shouldn't like the idea that I desire disintegration. Sometimes, not all the time. There's good reasons for not liking that part of who we are. I shouldn't like that my unconscious keeps getting thrown back at me. The traumas keep getting thrown back at me. Sort of sick, sadistic cycle. I shouldn't like that. Why should I like that? But the liberating thing is the freedom in realizing, hey, if that's just who we are, I'm not going to beat myself up. I'm not going to call myself, unhealthy or evil or sadistic or something like that, just because that's just the mechanism. That's the mind. That's how it works. I can still try to do my best to move beyond that, to be better than just that, hence the role of the ego. Humans are not gentle creatures, according to Freud. Don't let anyone try to convince you that Our nature is one of peaceful cohabitation. That's not going to happen. We can give ourselves every benefit of the doubt. Again, all the money, wealth, fame, and we're still going to be messy creatures. Messy, messy creatures. Hopefully more disciplined as we go forward, but still messy creatures. We will still hurt ourselves and we will still hurt others. Don't blame society. Try not to blame everybody else. That's just letting your own aggressive id, your instincts, lash out at other people. Sometimes that's appropriate, obviously. There's some bad people out there that need to be put in their place. They need to be arrested, that need to be, whatever. But often that's just us lashing out unnecessarily, unfairly, which perpetuates the issue. So we want to achieve world peace. What should we do? Here's my proposal. We simply be honest about our nature. And again, I'm not personally completely sold on Freud, but there's something to this. Let's be honest about our own nature. Stop blaming society too that is struggling as a collective with our individual issues. And also, try not to make ourselves feel guilty when reason fails. We seem to be setting ourselves up as a culture. We're dismayed when people do bad things that they don't have the common sense or they don't have reason. That's part of the power of what Freud is saying here. We shouldn't expect them to. That's that id acting out, going right by the ego, manifesting in all kinds of bad ways. We need to learn to manage our instincts. We need to learn to manage our instincts. We don't want to hate ourselves and we don't want to hate others, but we realize that is a perpetual possibility every moment of every day. We can't just bottle these things up. We can't just put a lid on it and deny that they're there. That's not going to help anything. It's going to make things worse, make us more unhealthy, sickly. And so, confronted with human nature, our own trials and tribulations that exist because of this, just the way we work, we try to learn to sublimate, to do more with these energies or these instincts, and then simply try to satisfy them, which could lead to all kinds of harm to other people. Why am I not happy? But I'm still going to try, because happiness is transient, temporary. Why is the world at unrest? Because each of us are at unrest, internally, socially, and otherwise. What can we do? Well, maybe we can admit that we've got some flaws. That's okay. It's part of our structure. And then we can begin to do something with it, positive, by affirming eros, or that life drive.